Okay, greetings everyone and welcome. I welcome you to this fourth panel in 3IE's virtual evidence weeks that have been going on throughout the month of May. This panel is dedicated to discussing the methodological and practical barriers to integrating cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis into impact evaluation. This conversation builds on last week's panel, so the intervention is effective, but what will it cost? My name is Liz Brown, and I lead the Cost Transparency Initiative at the Center for Effective Global Action at UC Berkeley. I'm also an incoming senior fellow at 3IE. Let me just make sure my screen is set up here. I'm having a little bit of trouble viewing this. Hang on just a second. So I want to thank you in the audience for joining us today. For some of you, this will be your fourth virtual session. I want to express my appreciation for your attention to rigorous evidence and to cost evidence in particular, and to the barriers to its more widespread uptake and use. We're of course extremely curious about all of you and where you might be joining us today. So we've posted a poll in Zoom. You can share with us where in the world you are joining us. Especially during these COVID pandemic times, many of us are sheltering at home, and I expect to see you coming from all over right now. So thanks for joining us today. Before we jump into the panel, I want to bring up some housekeeping information. First, this event is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. The recording will be made available on the website after the session. I welcome you to send your questions to the panel. If you're joining from Zoom, you can share them through the Q&A box. For other comments and messages, like if you're having technical problems, you can reach a host or technical person through the chat function. If you're joining from YouTube, please leave your questions in the comments box and one of our staff members will make sure to get it to the chair. Given the large number of attendees, we may not be able to get to all of your questions today. I apologize in advance for that, and I hope that you'll understand our limitations, but we'll be looking for your questions as they go along. If you could help us by keeping them short and to the point, we'll be able to get to as many as possible. If the event is disrupted for any reason, like if we have major technical faults or hacking or trolling, we'll shut down the session immediately and contact you by email about the next steps. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to say a few words about the motivation for bringing this panel together in the first place. Calculating a poverty alleviation program's rate of return is practically impossible using impact evidence alone. Cost evidence is essential for policymakers to decide how to allocate scarce resources or to scale impactful programs. For example, we have good examples of inexpensive and effective programs like deworming that deliver long-term benefits to both to individuals and to society, but the field really lags behind in any kind of consistent production of cost evidence to support this kind of analysis. In my research with Jeff Tanner at the World Bank, we found that fewer than 1 in 5 impact evaluations integrates either cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis into the evaluated program. That's why I want to bring these panelists together to talk about the methodological and practical barriers of integrating that type of analysis into an impact evaluation. Before I jump in, let's do a very quick overview of definitions. First, impact evaluations provide evidence of what works in relation to a counterfactual or what would have happened in the absence of the program. We're really looking for causal attribution to be able to say it was the program itself that caused the change that we see or observe. Cost evidence in this context refers to the cost data and analysis methods used to analyze a program's economic efficiency. In practice, that's mostly cost benefit analysis and cost effectiveness analysis. These are both methods of comparing the costs and consequences of 2 or more interventions. They're distinguished in the literature based on how their outcomes or benefits are measured. So in the case of cost effectiveness analysis, benefits are measured typically in natural units, For example, we would calculate the cost per incremental gain in math or English test scores for an education intervention. And in cost benefit, benefits are measured in monetary units. So now, audience, just to make sure you are still with us and to get a sense of your experience, I've posted another poll for you to complete. In this one, we ask, how many CEA or CBA studies did you participate in, either as a researcher or in some other technical capacity in the last 3 years? So, okay, we have a nice distribution here. About 42% of you have done one or participated in one or two. A few of you are real experts here. And then there's a large proportion who haven't seen or haven't participated technically in these types of analysis before. All right, audience, thanks for that. It's good to be in touch with you. Let me go back to my other screen where I have my notes. So today's session will be 90 minutes total. After I introduce the panelists, the conversation will be informal and open to audience questions. Remember, questions go in the Q&A box in Zoom, or they go in the comments in YouTube. Let me just run through the overarching questions that I'll be asking the panelists. These include, do we have enough cost data on international development interventions? And what are the implications if we don't? When cost evidence is produced, what is its quality and transparency? What are the methodological challenges to producing rigorous cost evidence? What are the challenges with getting cost evidence out there to the audience that are most in need of it? What education and training or capacity building is needed to improve quality of CEA and CBA, and who needs it? And what is needed to drive the field forward? That is, to increase both the quantity and the quality of CEA and CBA evidence in international development. There's one more thing I want to mention, which is that CEGA, together with 3IE and other members of the development community, including the IRC, JPAL, IPA, Evidence Action, the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund at the World Bank, are joining together to put a costing of community practice together. We will be working jointly to advance the state and practice of cost evidence in the international development field, and I hope that you're going to join us, because there's a lot of work to do. Now, without further delay, let me introduce each of the panelists. My first panelist is Katherine Pitts. She's an assistant professor of health economics at the London School of Health and Tropical Medicine. She focuses on economic evaluation and health financing, and she conducts applied economic evaluation on programs in sub-Saharan African countries. She led a supplement in health economics called Economic Evaluation in Low and Middle Income Countries, Methodological Issues and Challenges for Priority Setting. My second panelist is Craig McIntosh, who is a professor of economics and the co-director of the Policy Design and Evaluation Lab at the University of California, San Diego. Craig, if you can wave, I can't see you. Craig is a development economist focused on program evaluation, especially of programs that provide financial services to micro-entrepreneurs. He has conducted field evaluations in Mexico, Guatemala, Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania. He's currently working on research that evaluates the impact of cash transfers and more conventional types of development assistance. My third panelist is Constantine Manda. Hi, Constantine. He co-founded the Network for Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa, called NAIRA, and is the director of the Impact Evaluation Lab at Tanzania's Economic and Social Research Foundation. Constantine is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Yale University, with a focus on political economy of development and comparative politics. He has worked on a series of randomized experiments aimed at improving education outcomes in Tanzania. My fourth panelist is Katelyn Telic, who is the Associate Director of the Best Use of Resources Initiative at the International Rescue Committee. Katelyn analyzes the efficiency of social programs in areas affected by conflict or extreme poverty. She has interned at the World Bank in Indonesia and spent 4 years as a policy analyst at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, JPAL. At JPAL, Katelyn developed a standard process for evaluating the cost effectiveness of development interventions, published several papers on the topic, and trained staff in the use of cost analysis at organizations including USAID, DFID, and IRC. I want to welcome all of the panelists. I am looking forward to today's discussion. All right, without further delay, let's begin. Craig, I'd like to begin with you. In last week's virtual panel discussion, we discussed that just 14 to 18% of published impact evaluations integrates any kind of value for money analysis, including cost effectiveness or CBA. How would you describe the state of cost evidence in the main sectors of international development where you work?
Yeah, well, I think it's not news to anyone to say that it's relatively weak. Development economics has gotten very serious over the course of the last decade or so about trying to measure benefits in a very rigorous and internally consistent way. And we really have not been equally serious about measuring costs or having an in-depth conversation about costs. So, I have a number of different issues going on. One of them is just that the discipline itself is extremely broad. So you have people that are interested in political science outcomes, health outcomes, labor market outcomes, consumption, nutrition, and that breadth, which is an intellectual richness, is a problem in terms of doing things like cost-effective analysis, because many interventions have multiple goals and many researchers are working on agendas that have many, many different outcomes that they're trying to achieve. So I think that makes it harder to move the conversation forward because different people are perceiving value in different domains. But I think really ultimately the biggest problem is that we have just not taken cost very seriously, particularly from the academic side, where there's a sense that measuring benefit is intellectually challenging and interesting, and that measuring cost is a kind of a mundane accountant's task that doesn't hold a lot of intellectual glory. So I think it's a very opportune moment for us to be having this conversation, and I think it's an important agenda to be pushing forward. That this should just be a pro forma part of the understanding of what any publicly funded evaluation is doing, is providing not just one cost number of kind of this is what we think this intervention costs, but as Katelyn will talk about later, a sort of a richer, something more like a spreadsheet that allows one to think about how those costs would change if different parameters of the intervention were adapted. So we're in early days. It's a good time to be having this conversation, but as you said before, Liz, there's lots of work left to be done.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Craig. One of the things you said really caught my attention, and it has to do with the broad sectors in international development. So Constantine, over to you. I wonder if you can unpack these numbers a little bit. So based on your experience of doing cost effectiveness analysis in education, what's the availability of CEA and CBA or other evidence of costs in the sectors?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. It's pretty relatively weak. I've been relatively very lucky. I began my career in impact evaluation in public health and then on to education. And these are kind of two sectors that are relatively strong in terms of the availability and the practice of researchers doing cost effectiveness analysis and CBA. And so it is definitely weak in general in development research, certainly in a lot of the social sciences. But in the sector that I know best, which is education and education policy, and having worked with people like Isaac Mbiti, who's at the University of Virginia, and Kartik Muralidharan at UCSD, it's pretty standard in the economics of education, in at least kind of the experiences that I've had with researchers in that field, to include cost effectiveness analyses and CBAs. However, it isn't always the case, and it depends and varies. And certainly you don't get rewarded. There are no professional kind of incentives necessarily to always include these in especially, before you even begin running the experiment, before you go into the field, to be deliberate in thinking about how to collect this cost evidence and how to include that in the analyses.
A key takeaway from what both of you are saying is that the availability of evidence is uneven, both within and across sectors. There's some differences by sector. In health and education, costing tends to be more prevalent, but less so in other areas. The other thing, though, and I think there's well-documented challenges here, is that we have a lot of trouble with the quality and the transparency of cost evidence when they are produced. So Katelyn, over to you. I'm curious about your experience at IRC and JPAL. What have you learned about the quality of existing evidence?
I'll preface this by saying last year, IRC asked me to do a series of cost effectiveness reviews across all the sectors we work, education, protection, health, and so forth. So I got to spend about 2 weeks pulling pretty much every piece of cost effectiveness information I could find off the internet. And overall, as you say, one of the challenges was that the evidence there was not a lot of it, but it was almost impossible to tell what was underneath the hood of a lot of the numbers that you did see. I would say in maybe 50% of the cases, people would say the intervention cost X, but then you couldn't really tell, is that the average cost or is that the marginal cost of adding one more person? Have you included estimates of client time in this, or is this purely the financial cost? There is better practice about transparency of what's included in costs, and therefore allowing you to understand the quality in some places. And I think health has a very nice set of criteria for what should go into a cost estimate, and you can rate papers based on it. But in other cases, it's just almost impossible to tell. And I think this relates back actually to what Craig said earlier about the fact that costing is not perceived as intellectually glamorous. There's very little space devoted to reporting results. You can at most get one number in the paper. And so until we're able to dedicate more than 2 sentences to where we can actually talk through a little bit more, what does this cost mean, over what time frame, for which people, in what currency, I think that's going to remain a challenge.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm hoping to get into that a little bit later. Especially around, what are the venues for producing evidence and getting the evidence into the hands of people who really need to use it to make decisions. So Katherine, a lot of us are very intrigued by what's going on in the health sector over the last couple of decades, really. I wonder if there's a larger number of studies that incorporate cost effectiveness analysis and CBA. It seems more like standard practice, as Katelyn pointed out. There are criteria for evaluating the quality of that evidence that are well documented and understood. I wonder a little bit about how the quality of CEA and CBA evidence is changing in the health sector, and maybe if you can comment, if so, how so?
Thanks, Liz. I'd say firstly, before we get to quality, quantity is definitely a big issue. There are a huge number of studies being produced. It's hard to keep track of all of them comprehensively because they're published in so many different places. But we conducted a bibliometric analysis several years ago, and we found that even as far back as 2012, 2013, there were about 1,200 full health economic evaluations being published every year, of which about 4% were in low-income countries and another 4% were in lower middle-income countries. So that's about 90 full economic evaluations per year in low and middle-income countries, which represents a huge increase from a decade previously. And I think we've seen a continued increase since then. So, looking at those 90 economic evaluations, we call them full economic evaluations in health when they compare both the costs and the effects or impact of that intervention. And about half of those measured outputs in terms of QALYs or DALYs. So we would call those cost utility analyses, looking at the disability adjusted life years or the quality adjusted life years. The number of studies that were actually cost benefit analyses were really small across every income level, 2 or 3%, a handful a year. There were quite a lot of studies that used the phrase cost benefit analysis, but they never actually looked at benefits. They were really just cost analyses. So they didn't get included in our analysis. And then nearly half of studies which were cost effectiveness analysis, meaning that they measured outputs in natural units. So the cost per percentage point reduction in blood pressure, for example. So with this huge increase in numbers of economic evaluations, I think we have seen a real increase in quality and in standards and expectations of health economic evaluations. But that said, I think the quality certainly remains patchy, to say the least, across not just low and middle income countries, but in high income countries as well. And I think I think we'll get into later some of the things that have driven these improvements in quality, but I would certainly point to the existence of reference cases, which have been pushed by donors, especially the Gates Foundation, as a set of standards, a set of methodological principles that full economic evaluations should adhere to, as well as some methodological specifications that promote some comparability. And so there's the IDSI reference case that looks at how to conduct cost effectiveness analyses in health. There's the Global Health Cost Consortium reference case, which is specific to costs. And then there's also the benefit cost analysis reference case developed at Harvard. And so there are a whole range of standards coming out in health that I think are slowly pushing forward the quality.
I wonder a little bit, as you talk about those different standards, if there's a lot of disagreement between them, or if there's a driving consensus that's beginning to emerge in the health sector. I'll set that aside just as a interesting question to think about a little bit. But one question your comments brought up is I routinely ask myself, what are the sort of changes we need to make in international development as a field to improve both quantity and quality of evidence? I think one of the most prevalent methods that we see for evaluating economic efficiency is cost effectiveness analysis. It requires fewer assumptions compared to CBA, but a major limitation of it is this issue of comparability that you've already raised, Katherine. So, to have comparisons to be feasible in cost effectiveness analysis, what we really need are identical outcomes. This would make comparison among programs and between different sectors actually feasible, more difficult in the absence of it. So Katherine, over to you again, sort of elaborating on what you just said earlier. I've heard that cost effectiveness and CBA advanced so much in the health sector because of the development of QALYs and DALYs. Which provide a standardized measure of health and well-being that's highly comparable and can be even converted to dollar values. What are QALYs and DALYs, and what do you think about the argument that they've been really instrumental to advancing the quantity and quality of cost evidence in the health sector?
So QALYs and DALYs are two different ways of combining both the measures of length and quality of life into a single metric. So disability adjusted life years measure the bad, what is lost relative to a full healthy life expectancy, and quality adjusted life years measure the good, what you are gaining with the intervention. QALYs tend to be used in high-income countries and they're preference-based measures, whereas DALYs tend to be used in low and middle-income countries, although that's shifting somewhat. And while they aren't preference-based measures, they have the advantage of being transferable across countries because they're a single set of disability weights, as they're called, for any given health state. So there's a single disability weight for having HIV with drugs or without drugs across all countries. And it's hard to say what exactly has driven the growth in the health sector, but I certainly think it's very plausible to think that the existence of QALYs and DALYs have been instrumental, because I can understand the reluctance of policymakers and others to undertake cost analyses when you don't have an appropriate outcome to compare your cost to. So it makes it very easy to slip into a situation where you're just competing on cost alone, in which case it encourages people to look for the cheapest programs. And what QALYs and DALYs do is they allow us to measure not only the outcomes, but to compare very different types of programs. So should we be investing in malaria prevention, or should we be investing in the treatment of hypertension? And I think that for sectors where such comparable outcome metrics don't exist, it's really hard to see how you would compare the value of very different types of interventions.
That's a really interesting point. I think other developments in education, over to you, Constantine. I've read about a Brace Scale, Learning Adjusted Years of Schooling, LAYS, developed by the World Bank, which combines quantity in terms of years of schooling and quality, how much kids know at a given grade level, into a summary measure of human capital in a society. Do you think that this type of comparable multi-dimensional metric of education outcomes or others like it are really gaining currency in the education sector right now?
So, I mean, from my vantage point, it's difficult to see whether they are gaining momentum. I think it's definitely, they're definitely very important. And I think one of the things that I want to also kind of highlight is what Katelyn and others have said earlier is, what exactly is going to be under the hood in these metrics. It's important to think about that because when you are looking at evaluations of programs that are being implemented by NGOs rather than the government, it's not obvious whether the cost calculations that people put into these analyses are necessarily going to be the same costs that might be incurred by the government, right? There could be economies of scale in terms of how things are implemented. There may be more monitoring costs if the government were to handle it. I mean, leave aside the impact estimates themselves. And I think trying to get these multidimensional kind of universal metrics is one way to try to deal with it. But we have to also be very careful to think about what exactly is going to be the input to these metrics.
Okay, so careful development of metrics is going to be really important. Craig, over to you. More generally, is there a need to define and standardize outcome measures for each sector in international development? I mean, is that what we're looking at to really advance the production and use of cost evidence here?
Yeah, I think it is a very important goal. I think it's also important to recognize again that the development community is made up of many different sub-communities who really do have different interests in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So I think the idea that development as a discipline will be able to come up with a couple of analogies to QALYs and DALYs, I think it's quite unrealistic that that's going to happen. And I've seen a number of top-down efforts to create kind of systematized indicators across lots of domains have not moved forward. So what I have more hope for is consortia of people who are working on specific subfields, kind of putting their heads together to try to come up with some very simple and basic way of measuring the core constructs in their disciplines, and agreeing that basically as much as academics love innovation and as much as novelty is prized, that this is an area where novelty is not good, and that even if you're going to innovate in measurement, you need to innovate in measurement relative to a known question where the innovation can be gauged. So a couple of quick examples where I've seen this moving forward. One of them is the Experiments in Governance and Politics group in political science, which has set up these metacatas, which are organized, coordinated groups of RCTs on specific topics. So they're not only coordinating on the intervention side, but then very carefully coordinating on the measurement side as well, so that it's a kind of in some sense, a pre-designed meta structure to be able to analyze single intervention in a variety of different contexts. And then within JPAL, it's certainly the case now that different groups within JPAL are working to try to come up with harmonized indicators. So I'm the co-chair of the agriculture group, and we're trying to come up with a simple set of questions that we would ask to go into all of the questionnaires that are providing uniform metrics on the agricultural transformation. So I think when you get down to that level of granularity, it is a reasonable conversation to have harmonizing metrics, and a very important one to have. But I think it's important also to recognize the tremendous diversity of interests that people have, and that probably will make it difficult to come up with such simple summary metrics as have been achieved in health.
That makes a lot of sense. Over to you, Katelyn. What do you think about this same question? Is there a need to define and standardize outcome measures for each sector in international development to really help advance production and use of cost evidence?
I think that what is needed is a minimum. You don't need everyone agreeing that this is the single measure that matters and all other measures are unimportant. But if the goal is comparison, you need a measure that roughly everyone will use so that you can then pull that into a cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis for purposes of comparison. And I think that the way that Craig described is really how I have seen this move forward, where it's not a single universal measure, but it's pockets of people who care about particular outcomes, developing better ways to measure them, and then rolling those out within that kind of ink spot of evaluations of programs that you might reasonably want to compare.
Interesting. We're getting some questions here a little bit about, and I'll put these off for now, but the order of operations. Do we focus on impact evaluation evidence first, and then if it works, work on how to lower costs? Or are we going to need to do both at the same time? I'll leave that for later discussion, but I think that was a really good question. I want to talk, comparability is not the only area where methodological changes and advances are being made. So Katelyn, I want to get a sense from all of you, since you're working actively in the field right now, and I'll start with you, Katelyn. What are the big methodological advances that you're seeing in the sectors where you work?
So I may be a bit of an outlier here. I work at an NGO, lead an initiative doing cost efficiency and cost effectiveness analysis there. For me, the exciting innovations are on the cost side of the equation. What we have been working on is a way of understanding the costs of interventions beyond that one number that may get put in the paper. And there are others working on this. Some exciting work, I think, Liz, that you contributed to at USAID. But as an economist, it's silly to me that we look at the number, of a cost as a single thing, rather than reflecting a series of variables, things like the scale of the program, the input prices. And if we applied more structural understanding to that, then the inferences that we could make about the broader cost effectiveness of a program, not merely in one place, but in other contexts where those variables were different, would be much, much stronger. So I'm excited about developing a structural understanding of the cost side of the equation using the toolbox that we already have in microeconomics.
That's pretty awesome. And I'm really interested in discussing that more, especially in the context a little bit later on where we talk about audiences and what they need to know and how they need to get that information in the first place. I think in papers, as you rightly pointed out, it seems like published papers often have very little space to dedicate to cost analysis. So I wonder, what other venues we ought to be thinking about. Katherine, over to you. What are the methodological advances that you're seeing?
Thanks. Well, I think there's a huge amount of research going on in this area in health economic evaluation. So I'm going to try to name 6 things quickly because there's so much going on. I'd say the first thing actually really on what Katelyn mentioned, which is understanding and improving the transferability of findings. So that is the extent to which we can use primary research from one location to inform decisions in other contexts or with modifications to the interventions. And this is something I've been working on, and it entails a focus on using primary data to inform models that consider how costs and effects may be expected to vary across settings, and they really depend upon an in-depth process evaluation and understanding of the mechanisms of action through which both the costs and the effects are produced. And I think this is very much related to a second area, which is cost functions and moving beyond simple primary data collection and reporting of what the costs were in a given setting to developing production functions that show how these costs are expected to vary across contexts, or not just with changes in input prices, but with changes to local health system constraints, for example. And then a third point is the integration of these cost models with models of other aspects of the cost effectiveness analysis. So in health, we have transmission dynamic models looking at infectious diseases and how the outcomes may vary, and the effects of herd immunity, very important in these days, but also health system models that look at the constraints and how we actually effectively integrate all these different models with each other. A fourth area that's really relevant, I think, for this discussion is about thresholds and what the maximum cost effectiveness threshold should be. I think most people are familiar with the World Health Organization thresholds of 1 and 3 times per capita GDP per DALI averted, but all the methodological work these days have really rejected that approach to thresholds. They universally led to just about every intervention being considered cost effective, which means that they're unaffordable, and it's leading to a loss of utility. And so what's really being pushed now are supply side thresholds, where we look at what the budget is for health and then seek to maximize that budget and empirically estimate thresholds on the basis of existing budgets. And some really interesting work by Michelle Rem and others at LSHTM about co-financing across sectors. And so they've really they focused a lot on structural interventions for HIV, things like incentives to keep girls in school, which have an impact on HIV, but also have an impact on other sectors. And they look at how you could consider thresholds for each of those sectors to make choices so that intersectoral interventions actually get funded. And then very quickly, just to mention a couple of other areas. One is the development of more holistic outcome measures, going beyond QALYs and DALYs to well-being and sanitation-related quality of life in the water and sanitation sector, which Ian Ross, a PhD student at the school, is working on. And finally, there's a lot of work going on the integration of equity considerations into cost-effectiveness analyses with things like distributional cost-effectiveness analysis and extended cost-effectiveness analysis. So there's a lot of work going on in this area. I think it's an exciting time in health economics.
That's great. I really appreciate all of those examples. I think because part of what this panel is really about is to help people understand that there are possibly some interesting questions that we can be working on in cost effectiveness analysis and international development, whether it's in health or in some of the other sectors. And I think knowing about the examples from health that you've talked about here is helpful for that, driving that forward conversation. Craig, we've talked about this before. I mean, I think really academic researchers, to become engaged in a discipline, they really need to see that there are potentially interesting questions to answer. So a lot of people, as a number of panelists have already pointed out in the discussion, see costing or cost exercises really as an accounting exercise and not a whole lot more than that. But I'm wondering if maybe you could draw upon your experiences with cost effectiveness analysis and CBA to identify any interesting methodological questions that need to be addressed.
Yeah, well, Liz, you and I have spent many hours on the phone arguing over these issues in the course of the last few years. So Liz and I have been working together on a pair of studies in Rwanda that are USAID funded benchmarking studies. And so what we're trying to do is to compare kind of standard USAID intervention against what would happen if you took the cost of that intervention and just distributed it directly to the beneficiaries in the form of cash. So these are studies that are built a priori to try to make a cost equivalent comparison where on the design side, you've now put in the field two interventions that cost the same amount, and you're now trying to compare them to each other in terms of outcomes. So there's really a lot of methodological issues that we've come across in the course of this process that I have found really much more fascinating than I expected from an intellectual perspective. So just to try to riff on a few of those. So one of those is the difference between cost equivalence and cost effectiveness, where cost equivalence, the nature of the question anchors you at the same cost. But what if there was another intervention that was a little bit more expensive, but would have generated so much more benefit? So the ability to compare across scales is very important, but comparing across scales is implicitly thinking about what would be the welfare effect of treating a large number of people with an inexpensive program versus treating a smaller number of people with a more expensive program. And this immediately gets into a lot of really interesting welfare issues and issues about inequality that are intimately linked to the cost effectiveness question, but I think we don't often see that link. So I thought that was much more interesting than I had anticipated. What one even means by cost is far more subtle than I had appreciated coming into these projects in terms of we approach this very naturally from the perspective of saying, what is USAID's cost? Because that was the question on the table. But then, of course, there are also co-investments that they require from local NGOs who are their implementing partners. And there are also very substantial time costs that they ask for from the beneficiaries. For example, for a job training program, they're sitting in a classroom for almost a year. So That's a very subtle issue, and it's an interesting question about whose welfare are we considering and how we should be thinking about costs. Are these social costs? Are these donor costs? Are these total societal costs? So I think that's an interesting issue. Another thing that we came across that I didn't anticipate is that, there's been a lot of interest and discussion in the evaluation literature about the different estimands that one can try to evaluate: the intention to treat effect, the total causal effect on a whole population, the local average treatment effect on the marginal person brought in. And it really turns out that actually each of those estimands has a cost number that goes along with it, and it's a different cost number in every case. And so actually really thinking through the fact that the way that you want to cost is married in a very intimate way, not just to the outcome you're measuring, but to the type of estimand that you're using in the evaluation. I think that brings a lot of the intellectual interest from the evaluation side over to the costing side. And then the final thing I'd say is just time is such a complicated issue in terms of thinking about, programs that may, for example, generate more rapid increases in consumption than other programs, but are those increases in consumption sustainable? And how do you want to amortize the costs of a big long-term program, both over the number of beneficiaries that they're treating, where you're dealing only with a small subset of the people treated by that program. So there's a need to amortize costs across individuals. And then there's also just this incredibly difficult set of questions about when you're measuring benefits, for how long you've amortized those costs. And those are really accounting questions at some level, but they're accounting questions that again come back to deep welfare questions about the way that we want to think about trading off large short-term benefits against much more modest long-term benefits. And that is obviously going to be a question that will be determined by the discount rate used.
We could go on the discount rate for quite some time, but I have a feeling that's something we don't want to get into in this conversation, because that usually is a pitfall. But I'm interested in these responses from each of you because it gives food for thought for everybody looking at this panel, thinking about methods that are interesting in cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis. But there's a lot of other stuff kind of beyond the methodological issues. They're practical issues, like putting this information out there in a way that people can actually consider it and use it. And I think there's a mix of audiences: journals, policymakers, donors, institutions who produce cost analyses for their own decision making. But Katherine, coming off of a conversation here about methods, I'd like to start with your role not your role. I would like to start with your thoughts on what is the role that academic journals play. It's sort of been the traditional venue for producing this kind of information, but I think there's more out there. Why, in your experience, is it important for cost effectiveness and CBA to be published in academic journals? And does it matter which ones?
Yeah, I think, there are many problems with the academic publishing process, but I think that it's nonetheless really, really valuable and important for these estimates, which can have huge policy implications, to be scrutinized by peers who are from outside of the work. And I think that's one of the things that can lead to methodological developments, to greater methodological rigor, to making sure that these cost estimates are actually meaningful and not just a $3 and you wonder what on earth that meant or what that referred to. I think in what we saw in our bibliometric analysis a number of years ago was that the vast majority of health economic evaluations are published in biomedical journals, so journals that are really focused on health and medicine and public health, rather than in the health economics or economics journals, because the audience of interest was public health. And in some ways, I think this is great for policy purposes, but I think also what we saw is that oftentimes it would be a journal publishing one paper a year, or maybe two, which I think really calls into question the quality of the peer review that would take place. Do they have appropriately qualified peer reviewers? Do those editors really understand the standards in economic evaluation? So I think it's a difficult trade-off there in terms of getting to the right audience, and certainly in health, it's very important for it to be published in these health journals. But methodological work tends to be in the more health economic journals. And I think one of the ways forward is that we really need to work on improving peer review for multidisciplinary papers and looking to cross disciplines to say, for example, getting health economists to comment on work in other sectors and saying, yes, we realize you may not be an education expert, but comment on the costs, for example, and we will have other reviewers who are education experts. And I think it's hard in the peer review process. That conversation doesn't happen. So I think a final note, though, is open access, which I think is really crucial. And there's not much point in publishing in academic journals if it's not open access, not only to make sure that people in low and middle income countries can read it, but to make sure that policymakers can read it as well, many of whom aren't going to have institutional access to these journals.
Very interesting comments there. Constantine, over to you. I'm curious about which audiences that you presented to who were most interested in the cost effectiveness analysis component of your article, which was inputs, incentives, and complementarities in education using experimental evidence from Tanzania. What response did you have from the journal that reviewed the work?
So we didn't have any problems with the journal review process, because we had a great set of co-authors, as I've said earlier, Isaac Mbiti, Kartik Muralidharan, and so we had, even before thinking about publication and the research output of the experiments, we had already ex ante been very deliberate and particular about collecting cost data from the intervention side. And also we went a little bit further. We tried to imagine, if this intervention were to be implemented by government, what other costs are maybe incorporated. So we had kind of preempted any pushback from a lack of cost effectiveness analysis in that review process. But I will say, it's a natural starting point for politicians and policymakers to talk about, well, how much is this going to cost? Is this going to be cheaper than just an unconditional increase in teacher salaries? Should I do a school feeding program? Should I deliver desks? And politicians, love things that are visible and, they could cut a ribbon. And so, this was a natural conversation point for policymakers. I think what was interesting also is to see the political economy of to what extent people would like to consider certain costs important and others not. So the labor union, for example, the teacher union, was also very interested in how much the intervention costs, and not just the direct cost of the intervention, sending these funds to the schools or paying these teachers for the incentive payments, but also thinking about, well, to what extent, is the intervention staff and all this, and they're trying to benchmark, because for them, they're lobbying an unconditional increase in salaries. So they're thinking, well, if we didn't have this fancy RCT and all these fancy people, to what extent could we save that money to unconditionally raise teacher salaries? So I think for policymakers, I'm convinced that it's a natural kind of starting point. There may be capacity constraints in terms of actually implementing a cost effectiveness analysis, but I think on the policy side, there's certainly avenues to have that conversation.
That's really interesting. Katelyn, you've had a lot of experience with policymakers as well. I'm curious about your experience at IRC and JPAL. Is the evidence getting to where it needs to be, and why not? Oh, Katelyn, you're on mute. Hang on, just unmute yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would draw a distinction between different kinds of evidence. I think there's different ways, as Katherine started alluding to, of inferring knowledge from the results of specific studies. One way that kind of JPAL has followed is to get cost effectiveness analyses of as many programs as possible, line them up and say, overall, these kinds are more cost effective than those kinds, and here's some of the reasons. I think that message, when you have enough data points to draw those kind of conclusions, does tend to land. But it's very, very rare that you have enough data points to draw those kinds of conclusions. And so I don't think that the individual data point type estimates are entering it, where there's no transparency about what goes into it, are really landing and having the impact you want. What they do is spark a series of follow-up questions about what's in that number, which are completely unanswerable. And in some fairly dangerous cases, they're taken with much too much credence or external validity. I was talking to someone from UNICEF who mentioned a case of speaking to a policymaker who said, yes, I've looked at the peri-preschool study in the United States, and the benefit cost ratio is 30-1, and therefore we are going to implement this in my country, and the ratio of returns for society will be precisely 30-1. You don't want the evidence landing that way. You want people engaging more deeply. So I think it's still pretty rare that we're getting people to get the insights that are valuable out of this body of evidence. It's either not enough, or in some cases, too strongly interpreted.
I think this probably resonates with a number of people on the panel. I wonder, Craig, about donors. You've had a lot of interaction and engagement with donors, and often you are in the position of having to both present to the donor audience and then also to then submit your paper for publication. I wonder about grant donors. I mean, what is the information do you think that they really need and can use?
Yeah, well, I think this is a conversation that is most usefully targeted at the grant donors in the development space. I think that they're the ones who best incorporate the logic of what good cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis is supposed to be. They really are ultimately the clients for this. So, I mean, my perception is that it is basically hopeless to ask the academic journals to push this agenda forward. And I say that for a number of reasons. I've never had a cost effectiveness. I've never had the cost component of a paper competently reviewed, period. It's very rarely even paid attention to. And furthermore, one of the realities of costing is that you really have to cost while you are in the field, or sort of just when you're leaving the field. And the academic pipeline is such that you're usually getting feedback back from referees 2 years maybe after you have finished an intervention. And it's just completely impossible to go back and recapture that information and improve it. Even if you did make a mistake, you can't really rectify that mistake so far after the fact. So I've come to believe quite strongly that it is legitimate for the donors to simply require this of the academic community. They're paying for our research, and it's fair for them to just make us do it. And that basically the place that they're going to make us do it is in grant reporting. That's really where it has to come, because the time at which you're doing your grant reporting is actually the right time to be hashing out the details of costing. So again, in JPAL and in a number of other funding initiatives that I'm involved in, we're basically, putting in a few carrots, but really putting in substantially more sticks to try to kind of beat the research community into shape in terms of always doing costing, always providing data in a timely manner, in a way that is comparable across projects. And I honestly just have more hope for the fact that that mechanism has enough teeth to work than I do that we should sort of sit back and wait for the journals to get the religion and decide that they want to make us do this.
I like the idea of getting the religion there. That's wonderful. I'm going to push back on this just a little bit because, grant reporting usually gets buried, meaning that it doesn't see the light of day. And this is a point I've discussed previously with Katelyn. I'm sure she would love to weigh in on this. And Constantine, I'm kind of curious about your experience here too. Let me just ask you, open-ended panelists, I mean, anybody who wants to respond can jump in. What's the deal with the buried evidence problem?
Well, I'd say that's a lot of the benefits of peer review. And I think that's one of the areas where the health sector is different. I have cost papers published that just look at costs in depth, look at cost variation across 46 health posts in Senegal in the average cost per person reached, looking at how it varies tremendously from 30 cents per child to $2.50 per child because of fixed costs at the levels of the health post. That's published in a journal called Health Policy and Planning. It's definitely still a problem in health. There's definitely a push to have big impact papers and then have the classic, the cost paragraph in the methods, and the cost paragraph in the results, but I think there's also more and more pushback, and we tend to have enormous web appendices, and I find it very frustrating, but at least it is published and it is there, and it's like an entire paper as a web appendix to larger papers. And I think that's a lot of the benefits of peer review as well, as long as it's open access, is making it genuinely publicly available and open to scrutiny in that way.
Katelyn, I can see you're chomping at the bit. Why don't you jump in?
I guess partly I want to say how tremendously jealous I am of Katherine. And this is, kind of a North Star that I think about when I think about if they've done it in health, we can do it elsewhere. And I love health policy and planning as one of the places I see the best evidence coming out that includes rich discussions of costing. I will say I overall agree that it is donors who have the right incentives to make people do this and do it well. I have increasingly gotten excited about the role that implementing agencies play themselves in transparently producing and sharing this data. IRC is currently working with 4 other INGOs on an initiative to simply nail down how we measure the costs of specific activities. That's with many of their research groups, and so it's going to feed into impact evaluations and cost effectiveness analyses, but also will allow us to move towards some of the kind of cost function type work that we were mentioning earlier. And I think what's been interesting there is that it's a very trusting environment. There is a huge, the elephant in the room always is that costs are unusually sensitive and no one is willing to share costs. When I used to do this kind of work as an independent evaluator of an NGO or a government program, it was like pulling teeth. I had to go to Ghana and sit with the program staff and go through the finance records line by line because they didn't know who I was over email and they weren't going to share it. If we can develop an environment of trust where the focus is about learning and not about punishment, then I think there's much greater chance for, this isn't specific venues, but just a greater culture of openness. And we've started to see that in this kind of working group of NGOs. I think that's also the risk that comes along with having donors drive the car on this. I agree with Craig that they are pretty much the only ones with the right, well, I think as NGOs, we have the right incentives because we care about serving our clients, but donors have the biggest stick in enforcing those incentives. But I think that there's a role to be played simply for people who are interested in this, starting to send information back and forth to one another and over time make it public. We're working right now on a data set that's internal. It's 25 cash transfer programs that the IRC has implemented in the last 5-ish years. And we're starting to see partner organizations send us data points to include in that analysis. So I think that we can build this from the bottom up as well as the top down.
All right, we're starting to approach an hour's time now, and we have options here. We can talk a little bit, and I'd actually like to call on Constantine here. There's one question here about education and training for folks to improve the quantity and quality of CEA and CBA evidence. And Constantine, I'd really like you just to weigh in here on, in your experience, what kind of training is needed for people to conduct these analyses, and who really needs it?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And before I kind of get to that, I wanted to kind of have a two-finger on the current discussion. I think it's also important to think about, because in the current context where there's huge emphasis from kind of the academic research side on identifying the effect of some intervention, right? So using rigorous methods, the evidence credibility revolution, I think sometimes we lose sight of the politics. And this is where I think the cost effectiveness analyses is very useful, independent of the effect of the intervention. So, for example, in our experiment, it was a massive multi-million-dollar, national representative experiment, and we were in one of the treatment arms. We were testing current policy, and the politics of that policy is that whether we would have found a null or a positive, or maybe an adverse effect would have maybe changed the implementation, but the government was going to implement it anyway. And so one of the things that we were looking at is, if the government is going to do it, what is the cheapest way? What's the most cost-effective way of implementing this, independent of any learning outcome effects? And I think the evidence and being very transparent and trying to be aggressive in collecting this cost information, in imagining scenarios with the government, if the government were to implement this program, what are the costs that you expect to have? What similar interventions have you implemented? So we could use that kind of cost data to think about, okay, you guys are going to do it anyway. How can we make sure that you do it as efficiently as possible? And I think if researchers can think about not just the workshop or the seminar room where they have to defend their identification strategies, but also thinking about it from the policy side, I think it'll help both the kind of the program, the donors, and the beneficiaries of such programs. And I think back to the question, Liz, on training, I certainly think there needs to be a more explicit training from the graduate level, master's degrees, doctoral training, but also to think about how we could tailor some of these trainings for more of a policy audience. Trying to help folks in cabinet ministries in a country like Tanzania to think about, these are the type of things that you need to collect cost data on to help yourself think about, to what extent do you think this is going to be impactful, but also to help, the state of knowledge in general. And so I think even going through such training is important for the policy side as well.
Interesting, right? I can get on board with that. We've got some interesting questions that are coming in from the audience. I'm going to save our last question on what's needed to drive the field forward for our concluding statements. And at the end, I'll give each of you a chance to kind of conclude based on your thoughts of what is really needed to drive the field forward at this point in time. But why don't I read out a couple of the questions that I have coming in from audience members so that we can be sure to include them. One question, harking back, is have you seen good examples and approaches to deal with CEA and CBA in complex programs with numerous outcomes across sectors? How do you apportion costs across the various outcomes? That's one of the questions which I can let you guys mull over. There's another question for Craig and Katelyn. You talked about the potential need for standardizing outcome measures for each sector or within disciplines and between international development. What about between sectors and disciplines? As for multi-sector interventions, which may produce multiple quite different types of outcomes. Another question is, are ex-ante cost analyses based on estimated costs and outcomes less reliable or meaningful for guiding programmatic decisions than ex post analyses that use actual numbers? Why don't I stop there and see if any of you would like to bite on those questions? Oh, there's Craig. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I'll be happy to bite on that first question, since it's one that we dealt with a lot. We were looking, basically comparing a very multidimensional, complex anti-child malnutrition program in the study in Rwanda against cash, which, albeit the intervention is extremely simple, the places that the cash gets used are very diverse and very rich. So my takeaway from that is that it's extremely difficult in a multi-sectoral program to partition costs, because that introduces all of these issues of amortization and, the head office staff, what fraction of their time was being used on this subcomponent versus that subcomponent. So I think my perception on that would be that unless the program has very tightly segregated sub streams that can be independently costed, and that you can be absolutely sure you can isolate both the costs and the benefits of that activity to one sub piece, it really can't be done. And that in general, the right way to think about it is that the program is a bundle, and that bundle achieved this multidimensional set of benefits, right? So then what I think is the most constructive way of trying to frame that is that then if you have, program A achieves benefit A and program B achieves benefit B, that then at the very least what you can do with that is you can take the comparative cost effectiveness numbers across those two outcomes and you can use them to frame very clearly now, this is the exchange rate that policymakers would have to put on outcome A versus outcome B in terms of their preference for those outcomes in order to be willing to spend their money through one intervention through the other. So it allows you to bracket very clearly what are the necessary trade-offs that would have to exist in the mind of policymakers to make them willing to pay for one program over another. So that's obviously, not as tightly defined as we would be able to get to with equality or something like that, but it's the reality of the world where we have, donors with very different desires and programs that achieve very different outcomes. And so I think at that level, kind of the ambition is that over the course of time, you would be building up an evidence base that would give you a sense not only of which interventions are most cost effective in which domains, but also what are the trade-offs in very exact quantitative terms that you have to be willing to make to be devoting your money to one operation area over another.
Great. Anyone else want to jump into on the questions? Go ahead, Katelyn.
Sure. I'll try and, I guess, offer a lens that maybe gets at several of these questions at once. A number of the questions in the chat and kind of that you raised, Liz, are of the order of kind of what is the right way to do it. And what I think Craig was unpacking there is that there's, taking, for example, this question of I have multiple outcomes, how do I apportion the costs? What you need to think about is how would you interpret the results if you did the methodology this way or that way? And does that actually answer the question that you, as a policymaker, I think to Constantine's point about who is probably the most likely audience for this, what is going to answer that question? And so is it truly the case that the costs are separable and I could have run 1/5 of my program and gotten one of my 5 outcomes? Probably not. If that was your goal and you very clearly wanted to understand, can I get this outcome or that outcome or that outcome? That's probably how you would have set up a trial. And I'll maybe just quickly mention, I think it's useful to see what this looks like as a whole. So I'd like to quickly just talk through, I hope that's okay to take 1 minute, an example of what this has looked like to do in practice. IRC has been supporting a very large USAID funded education program in Pakistan and working with the government. There were a number of questions about what components of that are important. What was the impact of different components, teacher training, materials, corner libraries, what was the cost? So very clearly the trade-offs being made were which of these things are we going to throw into the bundle? How much more do each of them cost? How much more is the impact? We knew that from the beginning. And so the setup of our costing study, referring to this question about kind of ex ante analysis, the setup from the beginning was to capture those costs separately. And there's no way we could have done that ex post. Staff had left. It was like 5 years of implementation in many provinces. So knowing that, that's how we set up the costing. We tracked costs over time, including things like people's time on routine tasks and how that was split across the different components. At the end, that was wrapped up into estimates of the cost that could be separated out, or you could say, here's the bundle you could get. And that fed into the conversation with the government then about which of these are you going to take forward. Some of the decision is going to be based on the cost and cost effectiveness. Some of it is going to be these political economy concerns of how the teachers union feels about, this versus that intervention being added to the workload of teachers. But this is not a series of discrete methodological decisions that are, perfect in some abstract sense. It's very much like running an impact evaluation. You make a series of value judgments based on what you're trying to learn. And so the number one thing, I guess, more than any methodological point that I would say to the audience is that you should be clear about what your question is and what you're trying to learn. And that should be the lodestar for all the subsequent decisions that you make.
So
Katherine. Yeah, go ahead, Katherine.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Katelyn on the point that it really depends upon the purpose of your analysis, and you need to know what the purpose is to begin with and who you think the key decision makers are. But I would bring you back to the paper that I mentioned earlier. I've included the link in the chat on cost effectiveness thresholds in global health, taking a multi-sectoral perspective, because I think Michelle Rem, Melissa Martinez-Alvarez, and Anna Vassal worked together to put forward this approach that Michelle Rem had been working on for years of co-financing, and to sort of describe briefly what they're arguing for is essentially saying, for intersectoral interventions, each sector needs to look at what are the benefits that it is concerned with, that this intervention is going to achieve, and what is the maximum amount that that set of decision makers, be it the Ministry of Health, are they willing to pay for those outcomes that are being achieved, taking into account their marginal productivity within their sector. So what their sectoral threshold is, and then saying, okay, well, this is our maximum willingness to pay. Let's see if the education sector and other sectors that also have a stake in this intersectoral intervention, what are they willing to pay and are able to pay given their marginal productivity? And does this add up to financing the intervention collectively across sectors? It's challenging, but there is thinking going on in this area.
I throw this question out to all the panelists. I wonder, do you feel in your conversations with policy folks that they implicitly understand sort of trade-offs between sectors and this willingness to pay, and that this is intuitive to them? Or is there other language? There's a question here that's come in that the terminology we're using is intimidating. And I think there's sort of this nexus where we're talking about methods and making them more complex in some ways with the objective of trying to simplify them. We've got a lot of terminology going on. I just wonder about your experience and whether you could draw upon it here. Maybe starting with you, Constantine, because I know you have a lot of interaction with policymakers. What is your experience of what do they ask for? And is it in the same terms that we're discussing here, or is there a mismatch, both in terms of evidence and terminology?
I think there certainly is a mismatch in terms of on both dimensions. And I think it's important to think about, and we sometimes fail to do this as researchers, what is this policymaker, what pressures are put in place, in terms of that policymaker's deliverables, right? And if this is an elected public official, to what extent this person or individual is worried about the kind of being held accountable by voters. And so it's important, I think, to think about how to articulate what we can imagine ahead of time. But I also find that it's not necessarily difficult for policymakers, like I've said, to reiterate. I think the vocabulary that they use already kind of factors in, considerations around costs. I think what's difficult is to necessarily sit down and work with the policymaker to iron out some of those details and think about, how helpful that policymaker would need to be, for the researcher to produce good analyses that would be helpful to the policymaker as well, and making the policymaker think deeply about how valuable that kind of investment is in terms of having transparent data on costs. And I think that's the biggest problem. In a context such as Tanzania, it's not always the case that you're going to find easy cost data on the programs being implemented. And so starting that conversation and saying, hey, despite the fact that you may be worried about proving impact of the public funds that you're using, nevertheless, we're not going to be in any better place if you're not going to be transparent about information that's going to be helpful for the researcher to think about cost effectiveness analyses.
Interesting. Thanks for that, Constantine. I wonder if we can now poll the audience to get a sense from them. We have a third question here for you audience members who are still with us. Actually, our numbers are going up, which I consider to be kind of a good thing. maybe I'm obsessed with the numbers, but that's not a good thing. So the question here is, which barriers are more of an impediment, do you think, for increasing CEA and CBA? Is it the technical ones or the practical ones? Just to get a taste for what you're thinking there. And I can't see the results. Maybe we can post those after they come in. It might take a minute. We have quite a few other questions that have come in here. Let's see. One of the questions, there's a couple of questions about cash benchmarking. It would be interesting about some of the other understanding some of the other limitations of using cash as a benchmark. Oh, I just missed the poll results there. Did any of you see them? Oh, here we go. Okay, most people are of the opinion that there are more practical barriers than there are technical ones. I don't know, panelists, what do you think about that?
I would agree in as much as there's certainly huge areas of methodological research and areas I'd like to explore and exciting things going on. But the fact that all these methodological areas should have further exploration doesn't mean that we can't do anything worthwhile. And so the question is, why aren't we doing just, the basics, even to the standards that we already have and know how to do is hugely valuable. So it's really practical issues, I think, in terms of getting the funding to do it, getting the incentives to do it, having the skills and capacity to do it.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? So there's another question about cash benchmarking. Given the evidence around the effectiveness of direct cash transfers continues to change itself, does this complicate the use of cash as a benchmark for other interventions? I think I'm going to let you jump on that one, Craig.
Sure. So, I think, cash transfers probably have the best evidence base in all of development economics, mostly because they're something that is just relatively easy to study from a technical perspective. They're easily individually randomized. So there's a lot of work on both conditional and unconditional cash transfers. And, that evidence base is really quite consistent across contexts. So I think I see three different reasons for why cash benchmarking has become an important conversation. One of them is, cash certainly works to drive consumption, which may be very unsurprising, but since we've gotten used to thinking about consumption as being, a core metric of welfare, it's an effective intervention in that respect. The second one is that with the widespread rise of mobile money across the developing world, it has now become an extremely inexpensive and, with reference, for example, to COVID and crisis circumstances where it's difficult to operate on the ground, it's a cheap and logistically feasible intervention. But then I really believe the most important value of cash benchmarking, and this is really only true of unconditional cash transfers, is that they reveal what the beneficiaries of our programs want themselves. And I think that in and of itself is an extremely important thing to understand. It's not necessarily to say that the thing that they have chosen is the thing that is best for long-term welfare. There are reasonable arguments why that might not be the case. But I think it puts a healthy pressure back on the policy setting community that if you're attempting to drive an agenda built around an outcome, which is not the outcome that your beneficiaries would themselves choose to improve if their income constraints were relaxed, you need to justify why that's a reasonable thing to do. So, I think the cash benchmarking agenda is an interesting one. I think it has good kind of theoretical underpinnings. The two hesitations that I would have, the first one is it's very difficult to do. So it's certainly not going to be the case that every RCT can just kind of easily tack a cash transfer experiment on the side of it. That's not a realistic proposition. And then the second one is, at the end of the day, cash is just an intervention. And there's no sense in my mind in which cash benchmarking is a replacement for good cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis, because that really is the place that we can now try to put everything on a level playing field and compare everything. And cash benchmarking does not necessarily allow you to do that.
Excellent answer. I think that gives a lot of food for thought. And there are some other questions on cash benchmarking, but we need to start moving to close the panel. We have about 10 minutes left. And what I would like to do is give each panelist an opportunity to really discuss What is needed at the end of the day after today's conversation and based on your experience, what is needed to drive the field forward now? How would you prioritize areas for action? And I think of this especially in terms of our costing community of practice and also everybody in the audience. My hope is that conversations like these can help to motivate us and get us really interested in the research and getting it out there in ways that are consumable for people. You know, Katelyn, why don't I start with you? Why hasn't the field of international development really organized a response in the way that the health sector has done? And really, who should lead at this point, would you say?
I think that when we're talking about the academic field of economic development, I think it comes back to precisely what Craig mentioned at the beginning, the fact that this is not perceived as intellectually interesting. And so I think that drives some of the dynamics Katherine mentioned, that, you know, we're not making progress on some of these methodological barriers because that's not where people are putting their time. Certainly in kind of development economics, they're focusing on ever more exciting ways of doing impact estimation, but never mentioning if something is an average cost or a marginal cost when they present that cost in their paper, which I personally feel like as economists should make us a little bit ashamed. What's needed, I think, to move this forward is a recognition that there is interesting structural and kind of, I don't know, just stuff worthy of research happening in the cost side of the equation. One of the first studies we did at IRC that still comes back to me, we looked at 10 programs that delivered latrine construction in refugee camps in Ethiopia. Same NGO, same year, same country, same intervention. And the cost per person per year varied from $5 to $110. There's nothing in the way that we currently think about cost effectiveness being driven by intervention choice that could account for that. And when we began to study it, it's all about scale. Again, as economists, like, I kind of maybe should have known that, but there is so much to unpack. And at best, we kind of hand wave it and we say, oh, but returns to scale. But we don't see that when we look at case management programs. There's very few returns to scale there. And so I think taking this intellectually seriously, but not getting ourselves so wrapped up in the methods aspect, just doing what many of the great empirical economists, you know, development folks do, which is going out there, getting data, looking at it and seeing what we see. Just more time spent on that, I think, would yield quite a lot of returns.
Great.
That's exciting
Thanks,
stuff.
Katelyn, for those comments. So over to you, Craig. You know, what's really needed to drive the field forward at this point?
Well, I'm going to say something I think Katelyn may not completely agree with, which is that I think, you know, most researchers are pretty cognizant of where their skills lie and where their skills don't lie. And most of us are not really trained to do this very well and would never consider ourselves experts on this. And so, you know, I've really appreciated the efforts from, for example, Don Green's lab that has come up with like the standard operating procedures, that it's like, look, if you didn't already have another plan for how to solve this problem, just do it this way. And I think that honestly, that would be the right way to try to move this forward. That I think it's unrealistic that most people are going to dive really deeply into this and try to become experts in this. I think we want it done competently in every big study. And so I'm a believer in the fact that although it has not worked all that well so far to build up like a standard costing template, that more effort needs to be put into that, and that we need to be moving as close as we can get to basically saying like, look, if you don't have reasons to do it another way, this is the way you do it. And it should be, you know, this time, this discount rate, these are the factors that are included, break out these costs in the following way. So I'm usually happy to recognize like, this is not my area of expertise, and what I want to do is just take best practice and implement it. And so I think the community of people who are deeply sophisticated in this, like Katelyn, can really help build us up by helping to establish that kind of standard operating procedure. I believe that would be the fastest way to get us to kind of adequate quality on all studies quickly, which feels to me like the right starting point.
All right, I know Katelyn would probably like to respond. Katelyn, I'm going to put it over to Katherine and Constantine to give them a chance to weigh in. Katherine, why don't I start with you? What is needed from your perspective to drive the field forward?
Well, I think, international development covers so many sectors. I think looking at health and what has really driven health forwards, a lot of it was the institutionalization of cost effectiveness analysis in high income countries, meaning that here in the UK, for example, decades ago, it became required that you conduct cost effectiveness analyses in order to make decisions about which interventions will be part of the National Health Service, provided on the National Health Service or not. And that hugely drove the field forward. And so it was a handful of countries globally, Australia, the United States, Germany, that really drove the field forward. And so in low and middle income countries, the development, the sort of big takeoff in the use of economic evaluation has been more recent, but I think it's been driven by a number of factors. I think a more recent development that I already referred to is the development of these reference cases, but that's just the last few years to really push the methods forward. I think prior to that, there were research funders who already were requiring cost effectiveness analyses in some of the big grant streams in global health. For example, the Joint Global Health Trials Scheme, which require economic evaluations as part of their trials. So that's been a huge boost. Another is policymakers. It's slow, it's uneven. It's not quite the same level of institutionalization as I see here in the UK, but at WHO, at the World Health Organization, the evidence review processes increasingly incorporate economic evidence. It varies across health and disease areas, but many of them do. The Global Fund, which is a massive source of funding in the health sector, employs cost effectiveness analysis. It looks at these issues and that creates a demand for it. But more recently, there's been the institutionalization in a number of low and middle income countries. So Thailand in particular now has done a huge amount of work in cost effectiveness analysis in order to develop their national benefits package. South Africa, Ghana are also pushing forwards in these areas. And I think a lot of training, because economic evaluation is an integral part of the training in a lot of public health master's programs. So at the MSc in public health here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, students are required to take Introduction to Health Economics, whether they like it or not. And that
Okay, thanks, Katherine. That's excellent. Lots of ideas there. So Constantine, you get to weigh in last. Actually, I'm going to poll the audience one more time. We are interested in knowing how optimistic you are about whether the field can move forward to increase the quantity and quality of CEA and CBA evidence and international development evaluation research. So we want to know how optimistic you are about the prospects here. So Constantine, I'm going to give you the opportunity to close out thoughts. What's needed to drive the field forward?
So I want to start by echoing what Craig said about the need for, the specialists, people who specialized in this to kind of have some sort of template. And I think it's when you think about, other areas of the research pipeline, including, for example, some of the initiatives by, the Center for Effective Global Action at Berkeley, the Berkeley, Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences, in trying to, for example, have a very simple kind of, template for writing a pre-analysis plan. I mean, I think Craig is exactly right in trying to get something like that, and the example Craig, you mentioned on Don Green's lab, I think that would be a great dimension to go towards. But I think the second thing that I think is also important is to think about, after 10, 20 years or 30 years of us improving the state of cost effectiveness, to what extent are these analyses going to be believable? And I think in this case, I'd like to kind of urge, especially senior researchers, to try as much as possible to evaluate government interventions. When you're a junior researcher, it's very easy when you have an NGO who's come in and said, we're doing this intervention, and we're willing for you to kind of randomize or do some experiment. It's not necessarily true that it's going to be very helpful for the policymaker. And what are we learning from such a cost effectiveness analysis if in reality the costs are going to look somewhat different if the government were to implement? So I think in the same way that we worry about generalizability in terms of the effects of our interventions and our evaluations of those interventions, we have to think about, I think what I would love to see moving forward in the decades to come is a lot more transparent, detailed cost data from government, and as a result of interactions between researchers and policymakers in evaluating government interventions. And of course, I want to also echo what Katherine has said about the need for training. I think it's very important to have training. And I think some of the work that the network of impact evaluation researchers in Africa are doing, the work that we're doing in Tanzania with the SRF on the Impact Evaluation Lab, trying to build capacity on this dimension, I think is very, very key, especially among researchers in these developing countries.
Excellent, Constantine. Thank you so much for closing us out. I want to thank all of the panelists for your participation. It looks like our audience is quite optimistic, 62% optimistic that we can drive the field forward. So I'm very excited to hear that. Some are not very optimistic, and that's okay. We need the skeptics in the group to keep us honest. So I want to thank each of the panelists. You've been wonderful today. It has been great to share this time with you. I thank you very much.